Hello and welcome. It's that time of the week again when we put Africa at the forefront and bring you news and views you won't hear anywhere else. I'm Chris Maroleng and this is Africa 360. This week on Africa 360, we look at competitiveness. Africa has seen an unprecedented economic boom and the world's view on the continent is certainly changing. Africa has the raw materials and willpower to maintain this momentum. But can it compete in a cutthroat global market? Is competitiveness all about resources or reputation? Or is there more to giving Africa the competitive advantage? Stay with us as we unpack exactly what all this means for you right here on Africa 360. Competitiveness is a term usually associated with business or the private sector, but increasingly it's being used to describe the economy of countries and now a continent. Africa 360 producer Lindsay Schutel defines exactly what competitiveness means and what it takes to actually become competitive in a global market.
Competitiveness. The word is usually associated with private business that's expected to provide a quality service at a decent profit. But what happens when a whole country is expected to be competitive? The World Economic Forum defines national competitiveness as the set of institutions, policies and factors that determine the level of productivity of a country. For Africa, that means turning an economic boom into a sustainable income that benefits everyone. South Africa's official marketing agency, Brand South Africa, recently held a forum to figure out how the country can provide a quality service to its citizens, the continent and the world.
Look, for us, competitiveness is really about how we take the enterprises within our countries and ensure that we create sustainable value for them in a way that will make sure that the citizens benefit. And I think that is what we are starting to see happening on the continent, where even countries that are very resource-rich are saying that the resources now need to be used to benefit the citizens in those countries. So you're seeing a very distinct shift. You are starting to see a recognition on the continent that we need to increase trade between ourselves. They're currently probably just around 10-11% intra-trade between ourselves, compared to other regions which are much higher. You know, Europe more than 60s, for instance, in Asia, again in the 40% plus. So there is that recognition and there are steps being taken. The Africa of today is a very different place from the Africa of 10 or 15 years ago.
Brand South Africa rolled out the red carpet to investors and delegates in a bid to convince them that South Africa is still the preferred port of trade on the continent. But while economic growth on the continent has increased, South Africa has slowed, showing that the country cannot succeed unless it improves continental trade. Lindsay Schutel, Johannesburg.
In collaboration with South Africa's official marketing agency, Brand South Africa, Africa 360 recently hosted a roundtable discussion on the next 50 years of Pan-Africanism and African economic integration, both factors that could ultimately enhance the continent's levels of competitiveness. My guests were Ebrima Faal, who is the Regional Director of the African Development Bank, Dr. Essop Pahad, former Minister in the South African Presidency and now editor of the Thinker magazine, Chairman of the NEPAD Business Foundation, Stanley Subramoney, and Kenya's High Commissioner to South Africa, Ambassador Patrick Wamoto. Let's take a look at how our conversation went. Let's get into our panel discussion, and I'll start with you, Dr. Pahad. There's been a lot of what has been described as African optimism, with discourses of a resurgent and Africa rising as part of this discourse that we're hearing on Pan-Africanism and the African Renaissance. Is there any substance to this optimism, or is it really just a flash in the pan?
I think only in South Africa we'll ask this kind of questions, honestly. I think in the rest of the continent they're very optimistic. It's like I always say in meetings, we're the only country in the world where we have to say, I'm an African. Why? So no, of course, Chris, we have a whole number of reasons why we can be and should be optimistic about the future of our continent. The question is whether or not we as a continent, and I'm saying we as a continent, are able to utilize the resources we have, both natural as well as human resources, to do the kind of things that are necessary to ensure growth. For ourselves as South Africans, I don't think many of our people have still come to that understanding with that shift in mindset, which will recognize that South Africa will not grow, South Africa will not develop, South Africa will not solve its fundamental problems unless it really becomes an integral part of the growth and development of our African continent. So if we are not going to be optimistic about the African continent, we better be very pessimistic about ourselves.
Let me bring you in, Ebrima Faal. You heard a very positive statement here coming from Dr. Pahad. But the question is, this resurgent Africa that we're all celebrating today, is the economic growth in the interest of the people of Africa? Are they the ultimate beneficiaries?
I think one can look to three drivers. You can look at, of course, the natural endowment of resources that we have in the continent. There's a changing demographics that everyone talks about. And, of course, the trend towards urbanization. Yes, I think the growth is sustainable. It has come actually not from resources, as most people perceive it to come from, but it has come from actually very good economic governance improvements that has, of course, been tough while it was taking place. But the dividends we have seen. To the question, though, I don't think that it has trickled down. It hasn't been inclusive. And I think this is where we need to now start to think about new strategies.
Stanley Subramoney, one of the narratives and discourses on Africa that we always hear is that Africa is a country that is beset with corruption. That is a challenge to our development. But more importantly, when you look at the commercial space, that increasingly people are beginning to change this perspective on Africa. Is this correct?
Absolutely correct, Chris. Well, let's just start by saying that not only is Africa rising, but I think Africa's time has come. The reduction perhaps in the levels, the quantum of corruption is being visible. But more importantly, you see the rise of foreign direct investment. Now, what you've got to realize that capital is coward. Capital will go where it's perceived to be safe, the returns are high, and the risks are low. So that tells you something that global capital is flowing, and the perceptions of corruption is not there. But let's not discount the impact that what corruption has on the continent. Effectively, corruption is a tax on the poor. Corruption puts the cost of business, it drives the cost of business up. Ultimately, it's the poor that pays for it.
A lot of the companies that blame Africa also for corruption are the same one corrupting Africa.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is Africa 360. This week we are in conversation about how to make Africa more globally competitive. At a recent debate hosted by Brand South Africa and Africa 360, my guests were Ebrima Faal, who is the Regional Director of the African Development Bank, Dr. Essop Pahad, the former Minister in the South African Presidency and now Editor of the Thinker magazine, and Chairman of the NEPAD Business Foundation, Stanley Subramoney. And last but not least, Kenya's High Commissioner to South Africa, Ambassador Patrick Wamoto. In this part of our conversation, we look at the role of governance and leadership in both the public and private sector, both factors that are key in ensuring that Africa remains at the cutting edge of global competitiveness. Ambassador Wamoto, one of the also narratives that have been present in past discourses on Africa is that of Africa as having poor governance. Africa not necessarily being democratic. But what we've seen in your country has been a successful transition. What's your view about the state of governance in Africa?
Well, I'll say we've come a long way. A lot of countries have made progress. There have been lots of elections, although I would hasten to say that we also made a mistake at some point because we thought elections are the answer to everything. But again, as we've moved forward, we realize that, yes, you could have multi-party elections, but they may not be the answer. And I think that's where we are now, trying to ensure that political transitions go beyond elections. I think in Kenya we've been able to do that very successfully because we had our period of negative peace when there was no fighting, yes, but there were tensions. And we resolved it through a constitutional arrangement where we came up with a new constitution that puts in place proper governance structures, clear separation of power, a strong civil society, institutions which are strong and can check government, a proper opposition.
Dr. Pahad, the issue of governance and accountability and transparency is something that has been a challenge in many parts of the African continent. What lessons can we learn from the South African experience in particular around these aspects? Or are there any at all?
No, there's always lessons to be learned from other people, and so hopefully some people can learn from us. You can't give meaning to the notion that the people must be their own liberators, that the masses of our people have to be involved in the decision-making process without having accountability and good governance. Because fundamentally that means bringing into the political, economic, social processes the vast majority of our people. And very specifically, I should say, I'm going to steal Ebrahim's idea, but it's not, it's women. It's the issue of the empowerment and emancipation of women. You cannot have good governance and accountability without that. They totally interlinked. So, we need to say, therefore, to ourselves, what are the mechanisms that are necessary to make our public representatives accountable and with good government? What do we do to make this private sector accountable? Because they are not. They make important decisions that impact upon the future of our lives, and yet they're accountable to nobody, but they say we're accountable to our shareholders. Well, go and analyze who their shareholders are. Who are the major shareholders of these major companies? So we have to move in the direction also of getting the private sector to be more accountable, and for the private sector also to have good governance. And in our own country, it means two things. One, fundamentally transforming the boards and senior management of our private companies. There are not enough blacks, and what is worse, there are not enough women. And if we have more blacks and more women in our senior management positions, I tell you what, this country will do much better.
Let me bring you into the conversation, Stanley Subramoney. One of the things that you do is that you're the chairperson of the NEPAD Business Foundation. And the criticism here might also be that, in essence, what we do see is an inverse correlation in Africa between what we've been discussing today, governance and development, or flows of foreign direct investment. What's your view on what I've just raised?
As we stand, the statistics are that Africa has a mere 3% of the global GDP. It's totally unacceptable. Population in excess of 1 billion, global population expected to rise to 9 billion in 2050. So clearly the issue around making sure that Africa does it for itself is important. One of the challenges we face, and it's a tragedy of the African continent, is that we are endowed with natural resources, But what we do is that we dig the dirt out of the ground, we send it to the ports, and then we import the finished product. So what we do is that we export wealth and we import poverty. We export jobs and we create unemployment. And so the vision was about how do you make Africa self-sufficient, how do you industrialize, and how do you make Africa the winning continent. Underpinning that has to be some component of governance. Political governance is one matter, but corporate governance throughout the world, there's always a premium paid for corporate governance. If you look at listed companies around the world, those companies that have good corporate governance commands a premium. So I don't think we can dispute the fact that sound corporate governance is a neo-left or right concept. I think it's just good for business.
Good for business. Ebrima Faal, do you agree?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this economic governance concept is a two-sided coin. And it's a really tricky thing in the sense that as Africans, we've been labeled as mostly corrupt. And I think, I mean, there's some truth to that. We cannot deny that. But, I mean, we just completed a study looking at illicit flows out of Africa. And over the last 10 years, $1.5 trillion have been taken out of the continent, whether it's through legacy contracts in terms of resource endowments we have, tax evasion, tax shelters. But what is crucial is that if you take that 1.5 billion, that's more than enough to implement the whole PIDA infrastructure plan. PIDA is the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, and it targets major corridors, roads, rail, airports, maritime ports, that needs to be in place to allow the continent to actually be able to trade among each other. Our estimate is we need about $360 billion to do that. So you compare $160 billion that we need to raise against $1 trillion flowing out of the continent illicitly. So I think we have to weigh it very carefully. And also, I mean, a lot of the companies that blame Africa also for corruption are the same ones corrupting Africa. They're the same ones that are paying the bribes to get contracts.
We are of this continent, and we can only become better if we work with the rest of the continent.
Welcome back. Just in case you're not sure, this is Africa 360, and this week we are in conversation about competitiveness. It's a term usually associated with private sector companies, but increasingly leaders on the African continent and economic experts are turning this business concept into a national developmental goal. Now, Ambassador, you've heard some of the challenges. There's the issue of governance. There's the issue really of accountability and enhancing that on the African continent. But having said that, we are in a global market. How do we enhance the competitiveness of Africa in this international market?
The issue of skills is very important. If we can impart the right skills in our youthful population, then we'll be on the right track. The issue of soft infrastructure, I mean, my colleague has talked about hard infrastructure, but we also need to look at soft infrastructure. The issue of business practices, the visa requirement, crossing borders, and so on and so forth. I think that's where our challenge is. We need to address those issues. We need to make sure that we have institutions of excellent institutions that can impart appropriate skills into our young people so that then we can go out there and compete. We can bring our productivity costs lower. I think that's the best way forward. But the question of corruption, again, I agree with him, it takes two to tango. I mean, some of the challenges we've had with the international companies, and I like the work that Thabo Mbeki is doing on illicit financial flows. I think it will really open our eyes on what has been happening in the last few years between Africa and some of our partners.
Stanley Subramoney, one of the key things that has been raised by the ambassador here is the issue of not just being competitive internationally, but enhancing intra-Africa trade. But when you look at intra-Africa trade on the continent, it really stands in stark contrast to intra-regional trade in other regions like South America and in Asia. Tell us a little bit about that.
Intra-Africa trade in sub-Saharan Africa is a mere 7%, compared to intra-Africa trade in Asia, which is 50%. Intra-Africa trade in Europe is as high as 70%. Now, if we can get intra-Africa trade to start ticking up by a mere 2 to 3%, its impact on our GDP is phenomenal. So as Africans, we do not trade amongst ourselves. As you go across Africa, you'll see that all roads lead to the port. So the ability for us to compete intra-Africa wide is very, very weak. And it comes back to this fundamental point of infrastructure. Our infrastructure is creaking, it's outdated. You cannot be globally competitive with poor infrastructure. So Africa is poor because Africa is expensive. It's very expensive to do business in Africa. So my colleague talked about PIDA. So part of the vision is to get world-class infrastructure. The infrastructure deficit in Africa from now to 2040 is about $93 billion per annum. $93 billion per annum infrastructure spend. But what is important is that when you look at funding for infrastructure, funding is available and can be creatively looked at. And the colleague talked about the illicit flow of funds out of the African continent. As Africans, we do not invest in Africa, we choose to invest in abroad. So there's a wonderful opportunity for the continent to become globally competitive if we get the infrastructure formula right.
Dr. Pahad, one of the issues that I must ask you, do we loathe ourselves as Africans? Why is it? Yes, I get the issue of infrastructure. I understand the issue of impediments towards enhancing inter-regional trade. But is there something in this equation that talks to the need for reinvigorating Pan-Africanism as a concept that can also drive economic development?
We've had the longest period of colonialism on the African continent. We've had a colonialism that we call colonialism of a special type, where the colonizer and the colonized were sharing the same territorial boundary. And therefore, your economic development, your economic approaches, your political thing got highly skewed. And where Europe and then North America became your principal focus. You work in the media, other than your 360, go and look at your eNCA. There's some woman is giving birth to some person who might become a king in the next 100 years, and that's news number one. Why? Why is that news for us? So I'm saying that it was our own colonial racist experience which led to the situation in which we have to recover the ground that was made. That's why I said that it's very important for us always to start with here, that we are of this continent, and we can only become better if we work with the rest of the continent. So continental unity, continental cohesion, continental integration is in our best interest as South Africans. And I say therefore that the real challenge for us here, and it's not a challenge only for the ruling party, for the government, it's a challenge for us as South Africans now. How do we make that fundamental shift in our own mindset? That every time we open our mouths, and that's my appeal to all of you, you start by saying, as Africans, not I am an African, as Africans, this is what we need to do. Thank That, I think, is necessary.
Well, some interesting insights emerging there about competitiveness on the African continent, and certainly at how to look at solutions as Africans rather than individual states as a key to giving our continent that competitive advantage. In part 2 of the debate, which will follow hopefully this coming week, we turn the spotlight to the views of ordinary Africans and ask how to make competitiveness a matter to the man and woman on the so-called streets. So do stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, please join us in debate by liking our Facebook page or tweet us your views at Africa360_ENCA. You can always send us an email at africa360@enca.com. So until next time, when we look forward to remaining competitive and bringing you Africa like you've never seen it before, do take care.